Hey everyone, I'm Jeff Gable. So I should share my screen. Can I do that? Is that a thing here? I'm actually not seeing how to do that. There we go. Never mind. Okay, so as I mentioned to Joe, can everyone see that?
Yes.
So as I mentioned to Joe just before everyone started hopping on, this is going to be an extremely short presentation, and I want this to be collaborative and discussion based and Q&A, that kind of format. And I'm not really going to go into the details of Scrum, partially because I don't particularly like Scrum, but I'll touch on that. And so most of you know me, just a very brief bit about myself. I'm an embedded software consultant. I'm focused on the medical device industry. Basically anything you need help with embedded software for medical devices, let me know. If I can't help you, I know someone who can. You may not know that I'm the co-host of the Agile Embedded podcast, which is—
I did not know you were the co-host. I thought you were the exclusive host.
No, so it's I and my colleague Luca Ingiani. He is a DevOps consultant based in Munich, Germany, and he and I were in a coaching group together starting right before COVID. And after a year in that, he said, "Hey, you want to start a podcast?" I said, "Sure." And that was over 2 years ago. So we've been doing this for a little over 2 years. We're, released bi-weekly. We're 55 episodes in, something like that. And it's been a great experience.
You're welcome to share with us your greatest hits.
Sure. Yeah. So there is actually one on, speeding up safety critical processes. I'll maybe as we're talking at the end, I'll put on a slide for that. So again, this is going to be very short presentation wise. What I think the common problem with, and I imagine when I say the word Agile, or when anyone says the word Agile, it's become so overloaded and so overused at this point. And it's become this whole self-feeding industry that it's really lost sight of the original goals. And so I'm wondering if we should replace the word with the word nimble, because that's essentially what you're trying to achieve. The goal is the fundamental goals that you're trying to do are respond to new information quickly and to manage the risk of your program of getting your device to market by reducing uncertainty and learning as fast as possible. And so I think a lot of the frameworks, there are several frameworks out there for Agile. Scrum is one of them. People usually say, we do Agile Scrum, and that's just a big red flag for me. That basically means that they've bought the Scrum framework or hired a Scrum consultant and are now doing stand-ups every day, and therefore they're doing Scrum. So I much prefer, there's an alternative set of principles that I'll go over called the 3 ways of DevOps. This was introduced quite some time ago and really for the web development industry, but exactly the same principles apply across any product development. And I think those are a more useful level of abstraction to think about in terms of how to design the process for your company, because every company is different. There is no right way to do Agile, Scrum, Scrumban, whatever. There are lots of wrong ways, but there are also lots of right ways, and it very much depends on your particular situation, which is why I want this to be collaborative and for people to give me their specific situations, and we can talk about them.
Could you define these terms for the non-Scrum friendly, especially the difference between Scrum and Scrumban?
Scrumban is not a real term. So that's—
it's got the red underline there.
Exactly. So Kanban is a particular way of managing your work visually. So you hear of a Kanban board, and that's where every task, every work item is represented by a card. And the idea is the idea of Kanban is that you can see the work visually. So it makes work obvious and visible, and then you move it across. You're limiting the work in process. That's really the fundamentals of Kanban. Is you're viewing the work visually and you're limiting how much work you're doing at a time. Scrum is a Agile process that is relatively involved. You divide your work up into sprints. At the beginning of a sprint, you have a sprint planning session where you look at your backlog and decide the highest priority items to tackle during that sprint. That sprint planning session should be with representatives from the development team, from the business team, and the customer, if possible. That's ideal. Is you're saying, hey, customer, we just demoed something for you last week. Based on that feedback, what should we work on this next sprint? And at the end of the sprint, you actually have a demo where you demonstrate the new working releasable product. And then you do a retrospective to look at what went well, what went poorly, what can you improve for next time. And all of those things are fine, but most people just do a waterfall process divided up into arbitrary 2-week chunks and have stand-ups where people gather around and give each other status, and that provides no value. So that's kind of an anti-pattern with Scrum. Okay, so I want to go over these 3 ways of DevOps, these principles that I think they're still abstract, but they're concrete enough to where you can start to see how they're used. Go over a couple of anti-patterns and common best practices, and then we'll start opening it up to discussion.
I'd like to know, because I see your slides in advance, you have them on the side there.
Yeah.
Is there software that you typically use with this? Can I see a screen or something?
Yeah, I think I have.
This...
Yep, I have a recommended tools here at the end, but it's pretty basic.
All right.
Okay, so the principle framework that I want to introduce to everyone is called the 3 ways of DevOps. And those 3 ways, it's the principle of flow, creating a steady flow of work through your development organization. It's the encouragement of short, tight feedback loops to get information back upstream. And that's, that can be feedback from the end customer via a quick prototype, or it can be that I just committed some code to the repository and I have some automated tests that run, and a test fails and I'm immediately emailed telling me there's a bug. So those are examples of feedback loops, and you want those to be as short as possible. It's kind of common sense to everyone that if you throw some new, I'm going to couch everything in terms of software because I'm a software developer. So as part of our discussion, I want to hear from people on the hardware side, how this affects them. But in software, if I were to develop a feature and not test it very well and throw it over the wall and expect a QA person to test it, that could be hours, days, who knows when they'll get to it. And I find out whether it's actually useful. And then if we're releasing to a customer on a bi-monthly or quarterly schedule or something, then it's that long until the customer sees it and can give me feedback. So that latency of producing something, having it be evaluated, and getting the feedback from it, that's what you want to shorten. That's that second way. And the third way is setting up your organization for continual learning, continuous improvement. Let's go into each one of those just a little bit more and give some examples. So under creating a smooth flow of work, some of the particulars of that are you want to make work visible. So an example of that is setting up a Kanban board where all types of work, not just the features, but refactoring to reduce technical debt, doing an experiment to see if something is valuable, and bug fixes, all that sort of thing. All of that counts as work and should be represented up on the board so you can make a good, you can't judge the priorities unless you can see it. And again, limiting work in progress. Again, you can use Kanban boards where the same methodology for that. But if I'm a developer and I essentially have 6 tasks that I'm working on all at once, and I have the context switch delay of switching between them when I'm multitasking, and I don't get feedback from any one of them until one of them is actually done. So it's much better to, as much as possible, work on the highest priority items serially, get them to done, and start getting feedback on them. Reducing the batch size. So that's kind of a manufacturing term. In software, we map that to shortening that release cycle. So the release is when I actually have a software release that someone can use and try out, and preferably that it is documented, has requirements that are fulfilled, has test cases that run, and automated tests that run. So the faster you can get through that release cycle, the faster you get feedback, and the smoother the flow of work goes through. And as part of that, you're identifying and removing constraints and waste. So this is where in software development, we invest in setting up test automation so that we don't have to test manually every time, because that's just sand in the gears that slow things down. Any questions so far? Nope. Cool.
I got one question.
Please.
So, and we've worked together. So, but I thought it's important to ask, like, so in terms of shortening the release cycle, do you also at the same time, are you looking at risk management in terms of, oh, is this a change that needs to be alerted to the FDA, or is this more like all pre-design control?
Right. So, yeah, I kind of wish I had a slide for that, because there's actually 3 sort of phases there. I would say there is the prototype, the pure prototype phase, where you are just figuring out what you're trying to build. And I would say that is pre most design controls. You definitely want to have some documentation of your exploration. And I'm sure you can, Verna, you can speak more intelligently to that process than I can. But you have the prototyping phase where you're figuring out what you want to build. You have the development phase where you pretty much know what you want to build and you need to do full design controls. And then you've actually released it, you filed a submission, and from there on out, you're in a change control process. And so those 3 stages each have their own particular flavors. Yeah, I mean, these principles apply to all 3 of those phases, but maybe the definition of done, which I'll get to in a future slide, changes for each of those phases. So during prototyping, I advocate people, do not do heavy automated testing. Do not definitely do the rapid iteration where you just want to get it in front of a user to find out if it's valuable. You don't want to do the full design control effort on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to know, you say that, Verna, you guys work together in what capacity?
Verna, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, we worked for a startup, physician, actually a physician entrepreneur, and we were working on a project that was, a device that had software and hardware, medical device.
And what percent of your time do you spend teaching?
Well, right now I'm 100% because I'm not only teaching, but I am running a whole program across UCSF and UC Berkeley. So now I only have 0 to 1 client at a time.
I see.
Because I only have about maybe an hour a week, since I'm still,
and we're using it up.
Yes, but I was so excited, like I said.
I know.
Back on
it is exciting. And at the end of today's call, tell us more about that program. You shared it in the
back to Jim.
Channel. Go ahead.
Cool. Okay, so second.
So I did have a quick question.
Please.
Yeah, so my whole career has been basically in the pre-prototyping phase,
Yes.
Both in medical devices and in therapeutics and cell-based therapies and all kinds of things. So to me, maybe it's just because I'm so early and so many things are so high risk at this stage, it's kind of hard for me to put into mind how I would set something like this up, just because there would be, millions of tasks and millions of systems and subsystems and things like that. So to me, and it's not clear. It's hard for us to get in front of a user for a lot of things too. So it'd probably be a couple of months between cycles before we can actually get to a user, even with an alpha prototype.
Sure.
I don't know. So maybe this system doesn't work for us at this stage just because it's so early, or is there a way to implement it, a good way to implement these systems?
Well, I guess that's what I'm saying is what I'm showing you now is not actually, it's not a system. It's
right.
So the principles are, get work through and get feedback fast. And then continually improve. That's it. Those are the 3 ways. I'm just giving kind of more detailed examples. But in your case, and a lot of this is common sense when you think about it. And it's exactly what you probably propose. You don't spend time building a really nicely machined prototype when you can pump out a bunch of 3D models and get them in a user's hand, like a key opinion leader, whatever, or even just you yourself. If you don't want to show it to a physician, but you have people on the team with some domain knowledge. Anyone with domain knowledge can feel a prototype in their hand and say, yeah, I think this will work. Or I prefer this one or that one. So the faster you can execute on those things, again, that's obvious. That's rapid iteration. So there's nothing particularly special about what I'm proposing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess for us though, it's putting it onto paper. I'm not sure how to do that at this point. You know,
Okay.
like, so, I mean, we've got a box, we've got electrodes, we've got a wire. Inside the box, we've got a couple of different circuit boards, a digital board and an analog board, and we've got software.
Mhm.
So, and you might get to this, it looks like you've got best practices. So maybe there would be, if you want to talk about it later, that's totally fine. But how do I set up this framework so, you know, everybody's on the same page where you can all look at the cards and know what's going on and have an idea where we are project management wise?
Right. So I would use a project management tool. Jira is the 800-pound gorilla that everyone loves to hate. Honestly, I keep going back to Jira and just trying to set it up as simply as possible. It's fine. There are others out there, but I haven't found another one that is not some kind of new startup that I don't trust to be around for a while. So I keep going back to Jira just because it's stable and it's fine. And the main problem with Jira is it's so configurable. You can get people who are kind of like Jira nerds and they love to set it up and basically be full-time Jira administrators, and you don't want that. You just want it to be simple cards that you can move back and forth and say, what is everyone working on? Are you overloaded? Do we need to, like, what are our highest priority tasks in the backlog? All of that project management work still needs to happen for a very early prototyping stage company. I would say it's most important then because you're at the highest risk stage. You want to identify the biggest risks and tackle them as soon as you can. So,
yeah. So getting this stuff we're doing stuck into Jira in a way that makes sense, at least to other people too. I think that's the translation part that we're having a little bit of an issue with. And how much do we chop it up? And, you know, it's really a project management question, I guess.
And it's Billy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And Billy, to amp that up a level, not just getting it out in a way that makes sense to other people, but that makes sense to a regulatory body. You know, Jeff and I talk about this all the time. I think he's one of the few software people that appreciate the fact that you've got to get a document out to give to FDA because they read documents. They don't look at your code. They don't look at your traceability in Jira or whatever.
So what I would say to that is, like, documentation. So you want to be basically in that early prototype stage, you want to be documenting the experiments you're running, the results, the blind alleys you run down. That didn't work. This is why. It doesn't have to be much, but so there's Jira is kind of the place where you move cards around. That's all fine. The companion tool to that is Confluence, which is a wiki. There are lots of other wikis that you could choose. And the only important part about a wiki is it's a collaborative document editing. And so I would say, and you can do things like keep track of design reviews, you know, minutes. I'm sure there are tools that integrate on top of Jira that do signatures or whatever, but you don't need to worry about that. You just need to capture information. And I would say that the wiki is actually the best place to do that. And then to Michelle's point, you know, the default document output from that wiki is probably not in a format that's quite suitable for FDA. So I'll cover this down in some of the recommended tools. You do need to have someone who probably knows how to write some code to make a script to take that wiki and produce a nice PDF that actually has your logo across the top and, you know, the document version number and page headings and all that jazz, so that you can actually check it directly into your QMS. And that Michelle would look at it and say, yeah, that's pretty nice, rather than what is this garbage? Like, as she says, when, Michelle's seen the anti-pattern of software developers like me just like exporting a CSV file of a whole bunch of Jira ticket titles that says that it's nothing. It provides no value. No FDA reviewer is going to look at that and understand what it means, or they're just going to kick it back. So you do need to get data out of these tools and format it in into a format that's acceptable. And my contention is that should be automated. That should be software driven. It is usually people copying and pasting. And so then every time something changes, if you want a new document, you have to go back and do the copy paste, error prone, tedious operation again. Invest a little bit in writing scripts to do that document generation for you. I don't know if that, I still don't think that applies in that early prototype stage. You just want to capture the information in a wiki, and you want to manage what people are working on with some kind of electronic card-based project management tool.
Mhm.
That's so I don't think it gets much more complicated than that. But if you want afterwards, we can kind of look at I really want to hear about kind of the specific areas you're getting hung up on. And maybe I have solutions, or maybe I'm like, oh, I don't know. I may have to think about that.
Yeah, well, so we're not really hung up on anything other than, the team's growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we want to get some kind of system in place as we grow.
Okay.
And I don't think I'm the right one. My brain's all over the place, so I keep it all in here.
Right.
It's getting it on the page so everybody else knows what's going on too if I get hit by a bus.
Got it.
So that's kind of the setting up that system, I think, is where we're having a little bit of an issue.
Okay.
So I mean, understanding the Kanban process helps kind of format that system, I think, in a useful way.
Okay.
Bring up a good point, Billy, and I'm wondering if, as useful as this tool is in big organizations, it's almost more critical in organizations your size, where so much knowledge is concentrated in one person's brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of just there's no agile magic in that place. It's just
Nimble,
you
nimble
have to
magic.
you just have to have the discipline to write it down, and writing it down not on a Word document that is emailed around, but on a collaborative tool that everyone can access. That's kind of some people might say, oh, I'm writing it down, but then the anti-pattern is that it's a Word document that's emailed around and no one has the right version and that kind of thing.
Right.
So wiki,
I wonder-
online, latest version tracked, that's taken
It's
care of.
probably a step beyond this conversation, but I wonder if we were to have this exact talk a year or two from now, how we would be documenting things, considering AI and the like.
There's so many things, I'm sorry, Jeff, that's going to be interesting because the FDA is finally formalizing their thoughts on design control and being very specific about what they want to see in regulatory submissions.
Good.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a lot to keep up with. And so they're finally publishing what they call their current thinking. But of course, by the time they get to publishing it, it's out of date.
Sure.
So it's going to be fascinating to see how those expectations change. And then hopefully how that hopefully they'll start coming closer together with the way software engineers work.
Sure.
So current thinking is really somewhat recent thinking.
What?
Current thinking. by
No,
the time it's released,
absolutely,
is somewhat recent.
absolutely is the opposite of current. It means they talked about it for about 8 years. And then they wrote down the first thing they talked about 8 years ago because they finally got agreements on it. And then that's what you have to tell your software engineers. I need your documentation to look like this, or we can't get clearance by the FDA.
And honestly, like that really clear. So, if you and I haven't done a project together, but if we were, that would be the first thing I would come to you as I say, like, looking at starting with the end and working backwards from there, what do you need my documentation to look like? And then as soon as possible, I'll essentially write a script to format all the information that I have into that exact format. And then literally every single commit that I go in, I did this for a company recently where I have a bunch of unit tests that run, and that's part of my software development process. And I have this big passing suite of unit tests, and I got that information out of the unit test tool and out of the comments in the code, and built a little script and basically had a PDF that was part of the artifacts of my continuous integration pipeline on GitHub. And so for every single commit, you could go in and say, oh, what's the unit test report for this? And it was in a format that literally they can just put into the submission. So that would be the first thing. One of the first things that you and I would collaborate on is, what do you need this documentation to look like? Here, I come to it with my own preconceptions. Here's what I think you might need, but you would, set me straight.
See, this is why you're my favorite, Jeff.
Oh, so sweet.
We're going to have a project one day.
I know. I can't wait. Okay, real quick. So just going back to the 3 ways of DevOps. So we want to smooth flow through the system. We want to shorten the feedback going back upstream. So kind of implications of that shortened feedback loops. There's a notion of shift left, or pushing quality closer to the source. In a manufacturing setting, this would be, having QA right at the end of a process rather than QA after a whole bunch of steps in a process where you might have invested a lot more time and effort into a manufactured part before you find out there's a problem. In the software world, this would be running automated tests on the software on a per commit basis in a build pipeline. I can define that term for you guys if you need it. Instead of, say, pushing it over the wall to a software QA person to test, or even not even doing that and waiting until the product's in front of your customers and testing it out live, which a lot of people do. Much better have that immediate feedback that I broke something. Doing what I talked about earlier in terms of improving that flow and shortening that release cycle, how fast you can have an idea and have a working version that's fully done. That helps shorten the feedback loop, then obviously reduces the latency. It's good practice to, whenever there's a serious issue, to kind of, they call it swarming and solving the problems in a group setting. It's a bit of a drop everything and look at this. It's inefficient in the local sense, but it's efficient in a global sense of increasing the knowledge of the organization and solving a problem and getting back to a working version as quickly as possible. And then the last of the 3 ways is continual learning. One of the main, let's see, I'm going to take this out because that's, sorry. Got slides here that aren't done, but that's all right. The main thing in continual learning and continual improvement, especially from a software development standpoint, is improving your daily work is just as important as doing the daily work. And what I mean by that is the things like I've talked about, setting up a build pipeline, setting up automated tests, setting up that document generation. That takes time. And while you're working on that, you're not developing new features, but you have to have the discipline to devote a certain percentage of your time, your effort, every single development cycle to improving that flow. And so, because otherwise, every single time you release, you have to test manually, and that takes forever. So you do it less often, and then you pack in more features before you release, and everything just kind of gets slower and slower and slower over time. Whereas you can get faster and faster over time if you invest a certain amount. You don't want to do nothing on your feature list and only work on your build process. But you definitely want to spend time every week, every 2 weeks, investing in that process and making it smoother. Real quick, just some anti-patterns that I've seen. People thinking that Scrum, or even worse, Agile, means that we do sprints and we have daily stand-up meetings. There's no law that says you have to work in sprints. That is the way that Scrum does it. Often that is arbitrary. The purpose of that, the sprint practice in Scrum, is maybe in a larger organization, it's to give a team an opportunity to focus and kind of prevent that thrashing of priorities at the team level. So our team is going to work on this set of things this sprint. In a smaller startup, that usually doesn't make sense. It usually is just, hey, what is the highest priority thing I should be working on? Pick that, do that to completion. Now, what is the new highest priority thing? So that's just called flow-based work. There's no reason to arbitrarily divide it up into 2 or 4 week chunks. And the daily stand-up meetings can just be, I've heard horror stories of people being in hour-long, 2-hour-long daily meetings where everyone just kind of drones on about their status, and it doesn't provide any value. The whole point of stand-up meetings would be to let the team know if you have any blockers and, hey, can anyone help me with this? Get unstuck and get flowing again. But if you're in a small team that's constantly in the same room and talking, or constantly in communication, you don't have to have stand-up meetings. Like I said before, the phrase "we do Scrum/Agile" is a bit of a red flag to me. That tells me that they kind of just bought the framework without really understanding the principles behind it.
Worse, they read a book or an article. They read a blog.
They read a blog, like one of mine, honestly, or listened to my podcast and said, "Ooh." Another big anti-pattern I see, and Michelle and I will have healthy conversations about this one. Requirements and test case management in Word and Excel. So what I mean by this is, especially for software, but any type of product requirement. So you have a requirements document in Word, and you have maybe multiple levels of requirements that have to trace to each other. And so they're in different documents. And so there is no linking in Word of these requirements to each other. So every time a requirement changes, you have to manually trace through and make sure that anything downstream or upstream that it's linked to, you also consider that. There is software that does this for you, a requirements management tool. And I'll get to recommended tools in a minute. But just doing that in a general purpose tool is horribly wasteful, because requirements change all the time. That's really the thesis of Agile, is that requirements change all the time, and so you should be able to respond very quickly to a changing requirement and not have to spend a lot of time making sure all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed in terms of traceability, tracing those requirements.
I have a question. This is what one of my students. This is what one of my students would ask.
Okay.
Well, if requirements are changing all the time, does that mean your user needs are changing all the time?
Maybe, probably not all the time, but basically, you know, and it kind of depends on where you are in those stages. If you're at Billy's stage where you're just building prototypes, the user needs are probably more. There's probably a reason you started this company. We need a tool to do X. We need to allow a surgeon to do X. But you could get a device in front of them and they say that, like, I actually don't need X. I need, you know, Y or X plus Z or whatever it is. So I would say early on, very early on in the prototyping phase, your user needs may change, you know, a fair bit. I would say requirements, especially below the system level, the subsystem requirements, even during your design controlled product development phase, change all the time. And a lot of it, and some of that is just user like engineering error. You didn't think through something rigorously enough, and you actually build it. You're like, oh shoot, I forgot about this. Well, if we add that user interface screen, what if they press this? Then what happens? Or what if this fault happens at this time? We need to think about how to handle that in a rigorous way. So things turn. Go ahead.
I think that's exactly the point. If your requirements change a lot, it's a sure sign that you haven't thought it out well upfront, good enough. And that's one of the pitfalls of doing things agile or nimble, is that people tend to, my favorite saying is, don't postpone to tomorrow what you can postpone to the day after tomorrow. But that's generally what happens, that people think, oh, we'll do that in a later stage. But if you have a slight change of your requirements, you have to think through your whole risk management system, your whole everything, and you don't do that with slight changes. You tend up to do the change, and then later up you realize that your slight change had big impacts further on. So, in my humble opinion, if you have changing requirements, you haven't thought it out well enough.
Fair enough. So I
was going to jump in and say that I think some people also, depending on kind of the startup in the company, equate product requirements with design specs, where product requirements should be as broad as a barn door as you can make it. And then your design specifications will fit in that. And those design specifications may change because you go, oh, you know what, this part's too expensive. This other part's cheaper. Oh, it's still within our product requirements. We think this will work. But I think product requirements should be as broad as you can make them so that they aren't changing all the time. But I'd like to, because I know I work more on the non-software side of things. So I'd like a comment on that from Jeff and others.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. Let me see. Let me go back. So your original question, Verna, I think, was about user needs. So, you know, user needs at the top, product requirements, and then subsystem requirements, including software requirements, all of these, that's the hierarchy. There is more churn the lower you get, because that just depends on details that is just hard to think through. Now, another anti-pattern, I didn't list it here, but I talked about this, gosh, in my first presentation to this group, which was, I think, in like fall of 2020. An anti-pattern that I see is exactly what, and forgive me, how do you pronounce your name? Loic? Oh, you're muted.
It's the Dutch way of writing Luke.
Luke. Okay. All right. So I'll say Luke. A lot of people, when they're writing requirements, they'll just kind of put TBD, and it's basically just out of laziness. It's, I don't want to think through this really hard right now, so we'll just do it later. I'm actually very against that. That's not Agile. That's laziness. So that's using Agile as a crutch to avoid actually thinking through something. And the Agile way would be to think through it on paper before actually writing a bunch of code and building a bunch of devices, and then actually starting to think. So what I always—
You've been patient. Do you have something you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, just a quick comment here. One of the unique characteristics of how product description and user needs actually intersect and meet was working for a big company who has a lot of experience in manufacturing tools, and they were using tools on cadavers and thinking that that was equating to use inside of a human body, because for all intents and purposes, they're human bodies, right? Mm-hmm. What they found out is that they actually had to do a lot more work in a real human body with living tissue that's stretched and flexed than they could with a cadaver. So they didn't know this until they actually got it out in the field, start using it on actual patients. So these are some of the things that you find out as Jeff said in your feedback, that whoops, we had no idea that a cadaver wasn't the same as a human body. So things have to be fluid and change. And you go back to your risk. As soon as you know that, you're right back to the drawing board all the way at the beginning to start the whole process all over again, just to see if this can be used in a completely different way.
Right. And again, and that's not a particularly like Agile versus waterfall. That's like a very technical expertise based, like subject matter domain kind of based question as to whether testing in a cadaver is sufficient. I wouldn't know the answer to that. So yeah, it's a good thing, hopefully that company actually got to did their testing on cadavers, made sure it was safe, but didn't spend a whole lot of time putting in extra bells and whistles before actually, getting the base MVP into humans and seeing how it worked there. That would be kind of the Agile ways. What's the least we can do to actually get something in its real use case and start getting feedback from that. Okay, so those were all wonderful questions. In fact, I'm wondering if I should just abandon my presentation altogether, but I'll just keep going through it. So another—
Well, at least show us the pretty pictures, and then
they're not. It's not pretty pictures. It's all words.
Just show us, and then we'll
right.
make it just the gallery of us talking.
So stop emailing Word documents around. Use a collaborative editing software instead, like a wiki. The anti-pattern of doing X is painful, so you do it less often. One of the core principles of Agile is to lean into the pain, to do something more often if it's painful, because that will force you to make it less painful. So X can be testing. It can be merging. Like that's kind of the classic software thing. If you have people working on parallel branches of code and merging those is painful, so they just wait because they don't want to do that. So they wait, and it just gets harder and harder the longer you wait. And it is much better to merge on a daily basis and have everyone commit their work thus far. There are small exceptions to that. Maybe you could have a branch running for a few days, but I would advocate very hard to not have a branch running longer than a few days. You want to integrate it back into the main line of the code base as quickly and as often as possible.
Jeff, I'm seeing a parallel between this and coaches helping you do what you don't want to do. Like my trainer saying, come on, you haven't exercised, or my dietitian saying, stop eating that. It's like, here's a software tool to help you do what you don't want to do, or do what you find painful. And I just wonder, diets fail and exercise routines, I gave it 3 weeks and then I kind of, am I going to look at the same thing here where it's like, yeah, I have it there and I know about it, but.
Yes, no, that absolutely happens. And I guess the point is to, you have to have that support, and enforcement's a bit of a harsh word, but to some extent enforcement from the top of this is how we work as a team. And if something is painful, like you don't make someone eat the raw unseasoned broccoli over and over. Like you find a way to make the vegetables palatable and tasty. Instead of doing the actual painful thing, you make it less painful.
Yeah, and I would say
So-
also make sure that your team is diverse enough to where you don't have everyone saying this is painful. Get that nerdy person who loves organizing, scheduling,
Yeah.
to keep and herding cats, because there's people who love to do that. Or get
That's-
the Michelle Lotz who will give you like therapy.
That's a great point. And I think to Billy's question earlier about how, his organization, he's not the one to set up the, that project management system. That's totally fine. Someone has to do it. And so if that's kind of a personal weakness or something it's just like pulling fingernails, then find someone on your team or bring in someone from the outside who can help you do that.
Jeff, I gently insist you move to the next slide.
Best practices. So a big one, and this is back to everyone who's brought up risk management. Thank you. You need a definition of done. And so this is, again, focusing on software features. A software feature that I add to my code, it's not done until it's documented, until the risks were analyzed and managed, and it's tested. And as part of the risk analyze and manage, if essentially it involved a change in requirement, then the requirements document better have been updated first. And so that's where you get that disconnect of people say, oh, I'm done with this feature. Is it documented? No, I'll get to that later. Is it tested? No, I'll get to that later. Is the requirements document up to date? No, then it's not done. So that's just part of being a professional engineer. This is part of the definition of done. And as a leader of a development organization, that's what you have to enforce. I will say though, again, this is back to Billy's, where he is in his organization, what Verna brought up. So you need to, during that early prototyping phase, you should just pump features out to get feedback on them without doing all the documentation and all the risk management, because you don't even know if that feature is valuable at all. Software has a particular terminology for that called a coding spike, where you do things without unit tests, without making it nicely architected. You just want to do something to explore and see whether something a feature is technically feasible, or get it in front of someone and say, hey, does this actually valuable? And then once you get the answer, yes, it is feasible, and yes, it is valuable, then you go back and do it the right way. So you want that balance between learning by prototyping new things, but if you've done that too much and you haven't gotten any of them done, now you have all this technical debt built up, and essentially that's work in progress that you haven't limited. So now you have all of these features, none of which are done. They're all in the pipeline, and they're all kind of on your to-do list, and that's a lot of work in progress, which slows things down. Thoughts there? No. And I like to exercise, so holding V&V at the end, like, yes, you go through formal V&V, but you should have been exercising, writing those test plans and exercising them early. And again, as part of leaning into the pain, if you automate as many of those test plans as possible. So a lot of software V&V can be done with automated scripts and hardware in the loop testing. So I have a device sitting on my desk, and I have a bunch of scripts on my computer, and it sends commands, gets data out, verifies it, has results. I can then write a script to take that data and format it as an integration test report that Michelle can check right into the QMS and include in her submission. Whereas if it's a whole bunch of manual testing, some things have to be tested manually. You can't get around that. But as much as you can limit and streamline that as much as possible, it makes that testing faster. And so therefore you can do it more often. All right, last thing is just some recommended tools. Again, Jira is the one everyone loves to hate, including me, but I say just go with Jira for issue management and bug tracking, unless you have another project management tool that you really love. And my only point with Jira is keep it simple. It's easy to go down the rabbit hole. Don't just have cards. You move them from like backlog to doing to done, and that's it. Some collaborative editing with a wiki. Confluence is the companion product to Jira. And you want to automate that document generation as much as possible. That will probably require some custom software. So go ahead, someone. Nope. So that will require some custom scripts to generate that document, but I have, that's always been well worth it. And then, it looks like Rick has his hand up. What's up, Rick?
Yeah, just two quick questions. As far as using this method, what is the minimum size group that you really want to have, including your customer reps? Is it like 8 or a dozen or what?
Minimum size group in order to use something like Jira?
Yeah, well, in order to really take advantage of this method of organization.
I don't think there is a minimum size. I mean, this is kind of I apply these principles to my own work. And I've worked for the startup that Vernon and I worked on was what, 6 people total. And so really trying to I don't think there is a minimum size is the short answer.
Okay, and the second question was, has anybody ever, a lot of what you're doing I do with OneNote, has anybody ever used a generic software to manage these kind of things?
Yeah, OneNote certainly, yes, is the short answer. So the only problem with things like OneNote, if you do it in, say, Office 365 and everyone can collaborate on a document, then I have no problem with it. It's when you have OneNote on yours and you're emailing the OneNote file around, that's where I have the issue with it. I think it needs to be online, and so that that anyone can edit it and see the latest version easily. That to me is kind of the requirement for that.
Yeah, that's true. And even if they don't have 365, if they just have, if they just have the OneNote on their machine, if I've got it, then it's still online. So
kind of, but then like you're sharing files via Dropbox, and that's better than emailing, but it's still pretty bad because it's not.
Oh no, it automatically does it. I've got 2 or 3 people I'm working on projects with, and you just have to have one person on 365, and then it's online. You can access it.
Okay, yeah.
As long as no people, then you have a problem.
Okay, got it. Yeah, as long as collaboration is seamless, knock yourself out.
Yeah.
So we've been using Teams, and Teams did have a wiki for a while, but they're kind of pushing everybody into using OneNote now. But that's integrated with everybody on the team. It's like a shared OneNote, and they have Planner, and which is like really easy or dumbed down Jira. So it has Kanban boards and things like that. So that's what we've been trying to use and implement everything into Teams. Nothing's ever perfect, but try to keep everything in one place and cheap at early stages.
Yeah, like if it works for you, do it. Like I'm not the kind of the recommendation for Jira and Confluence. That's if someone has no idea. If you have a tool that works for you, that the requirements that I kind of have for it is cloud-based, easy collaboration. Everyone can easily find the latest version. And then for that, and that's for like the project management and just documentation, like any of your system architecture or detailed design specs, like Verda was talking about, all of that should be, say, in a wiki. The requirements and test case management, that I think requires a dedicated tool that does that tracing for you. I'm a fan of Matrix. We use that at the startup that Verna and I worked on. And I'm curious to try, there's one called Ketrix, and they're actually integrated on top of Jira, and they pull information from Jira. I'm curious to try them. I've spoken, kind of sat through a sales call with them, but I haven't tried it myself. There are others like JAMA and Polarian and lots of others out there. I do like Matrix because it's relatively fast, relatively simple, and their document output is flexible and can be formatted however you like. And I like that because I like that, again, automatic generation of documents is a key thing for me. So if you're looking for software lifecycle management, give Matrix a try.
I've got a quick question, Jeff, and then I've got to jump off. But
sure.
So when I've got students that come in, they've used Agile. Okay. And so, but I'm trying to tell, in general, like software to do Agile. And so my understanding is that, okay, that's great, but I'm teaching them about building a Gantt chart. And they go, oh, well, where I worked, we used Agile. And I'm like, okay, well, that's good. But like, how do you document when your project's going to be done, when you're going to launch commercializing? And so they go, well, that's just what we use. So can you comment? My understanding is that you would use Agile in these kind of at a lower level, and that, but you still have to have a freaking Gantt chart. I don't see it as a replacement, or can you comment on that? Because maybe
Sure.
I'm missing something, or maybe I need to bang my students on the head more. I don't know. Help me out.
So, okay. There's a couple of different ways I can go with this. So the way you reconcile, the fundamental thesis of Agile is that you learn new information. It's the antithesis of waterfall, where you do all the planning up front, you spend a long time developing a product, and then you get feedback in the end, and you realize that what you built is not what the customer wants. That's the problem with waterfall. So Agile was a response to that. It's basically saying the sooner you can get feedback, the better. So that's great. That manages program risk. That's not in conflict with anything about product development.
Mm-hmm.
What people go too far is, well, since we're doing Agile, we don't have dates. Well, that's not the case. Like, the reality of business is that there are other parts of the organization. Marketing has to know, when are we launching this thing? Regulatory needs to know, when are we submitting this thing? And you have to work backward from those dates. What I would say is the Agile way of doing product development that integrates with fixed constraints from the business is you do the highest value activities first and get to something that is releasable as quickly as you can, and then you iterate from there. So you'll see FDA talking about, FDA says, oh, we're all friendly about Agile, you don't have to do waterfall. And they kind of, the alternatives to waterfall for FDA, they say, are you doing incremental development or iterative development, or a hybrid of the two? Incremental is where you're, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you just hit the nail on the head. Like the thought process is not Agile versus Gantt. It's Agile versus waterfall, but you still need a Gantt chart.
Yeah, there's no problem with having fixed dates, like real life constraints that you have to deal with. And the whole point is that you want to get to something that's acceptable as soon as possible. And as long as that's before the date when it's released, then you can iterate on it and make it better as much as possible until the drop dead date. But it's where you pack on too many features, and that's when you start going past and violating those constraints.
And also, I don't know, I'm not going to check, but Zoho is a product that I had my students use, mostly because I tried to force the issue of Microsoft Project, because that's what everybody uses in the industry. But students, half of them come in with apples, and it's just a big problem. So Zoho has both an Agile plugin as well as Gantt. And so I was wondering, has anybody here used Zoho before? Because my students were using it. That seemed to be the right solution, but anybody have used Zoho at all?
I've heard of them, but I've never used them.
Okay, I'm gonna have to drop off. Great to see everybody. Okay, thanks so much, Jeff. I'm gonna read.
I
think
I was just gonna say before you go, ClickUp. ClickUp looked really good. Have them check that out.
Say it again.
ClickUp. It's
ClickUp.
web-based.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
check that out too.
Put that in the
Okay.
chat. Luke, you have something? You muted yourself. You just muted yourself.
I thought I clicked on unmute. I'm a hardware guy, and Jeff is a software guy, but he's still likable. You have a lot of emphasis on shortening the feedback loop, but in hardware development, the loops are much bigger. I mean, just to make your hardware, to order your PCBs or even your 3D printed 3D model, those cycles are bigger. And suppose you have your development plan for the next 2 years, then there's only room for so many cycles, big cycles in your development. So I'm curious how you fit in. If you do firmware development, you always have to accompany the hardware development that goes in big cycles. Aren't you the how do you call it in English? The strange duck in the pool?
Strange duck in the pool, the black swan.
The black swan?
So this is what, that's why I'm the co-host of the Agile Embedded podcast, because embedded software, we have to deal with real physical hardware. There's a few techniques. So the main thing is you decouple your firmware from the hardware as much as possible. And that's often almost completely. Like, you can have a nice hardware abstraction layer where I can run my firmware on a simulator on the desktop. At that point, you can be as late as you want with the hardware. and I'm going full bore developing new features. There are some features that are tightly coupled to the hardware, but those are often that's not the majority of the code. I would say it's typical that 85% or 90% of the code is hardware independent. Is just the function of the device, the user interface, and you can essentially simulate the hardware and not be dependent on it to make progress on development. The other thing is, I would suggest you listen to a couple of recent episodes of the podcast. We actually had someone on, his name was also Luca. He runs a product development firm in Slovenia, I think called Irnas. He approached my co-host for training because his hardware iteration was faster than his firmware iteration. They were doing new PCBs every 2 weeks. Kind of blew my mind. I didn't think that was possible. But he has invested in his company, in their processes, being able to do that. So I wouldn't treat very long hardware development cycles as a given. I think there is room to improve. I don't know if it's worth it for your particular organization, but certainly, given whatever slow hardware cycles you have, firmware development is generally going to cycle faster, and there are firmware techniques to divorce oneself from the hardware so that you can do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, fair enough.
You don't buy it. You don't buy the whole
Well-
fast hardware iteration. It's cool.
No, yeah, but if you do that, you're only probably focus. Suppose you have a big chunk of difficult hardware and you focus on one part and you want to iterate very fast on that part. So you buy a lot of different versions every 2 weeks just to investigate. Then usually you find out that a few months later you totally redesign that part anyway. So you have completely thrown away your development cycles, your fast development cycles, in favor for something you won't use at all.
Okay, I mean,
it can be. It depends on your hardware, I guess.
yeah, and we're in a weird time right now where I don't know the current state of the chip shortage, but it's been pretty brutal, and people making plans and having boards designed, and then there's no supply of the processor you just chose, so now you have to redesign from scratch.
We still have a part that's planned to be delivered in January 2025.
God. Yeah, so that's just a difficult environment to work in. But I'll just say, from a firmware development standpoint, we talk about that a lot on my podcast of how to develop without the hardware. We've had like 7 or 8 episodes just on that.
Fast, another question. How early in the process do you get into change management, change control? Because every time then change control comes in, it gets a little bit more sluggish because then you have your change control board meetings that have to approve your changes. And I mean, everything you say will raise another few questions that you have to answer the next week or the next meeting. How far in the process are you into when you get into change control?
I would say basically once you lock it down for final V&V before a submission. Up to that, I would say it's not changed. It's part of kind of the normal development process, and you need to, you mentioned in the chat that you liked the definition of done. Risk manage, requirements updated, documentation done, testing done. As long as you've done that process and essentially your team agrees that yes, you have done those activities, I don't see the need to involve a change control board at that point. It depends on your situation. I guess I can't speak to your particular.
In our quality management system, the change control starts at the end of the prototyping process. In the prototyping process at the end, and then to the alpha phase. So it's pretty early in the.
That to me seems too early. That you're introducing. Does that process provide value? Like, does that change control board discover things that the engineers didn't foresee because they have kind of that system level view, or is it just?
I guess they just then forced to think more the like you say, the definition of done, that they forced to evaluate the things they invented for risk management, for all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, someone has to enforce that definition of done. I would like it to be the manager of the developers. And I would like to empower the developers to ask all those questions and perform all their work themselves and prove it to their manager, and not, you do have to have the right skill set in the room to evaluate whether any new feature or anything, what the system-wide impact of that is. But that's a technical skill, not a bureaucratic thing,
I have a bureaucratic thing here, and I'm
Sure.
going to declare this broadcast done.
Oh, wow.
But I will say, I enjoyed it because while it drew a smaller crowd because of the topic, everyone who stayed on is very invested and went deep with you, which is
Thank you.
nice how it balances like everyone needs to know that versus a smaller, and we accommodate them in different weeks. So thank you, Jeff. Next
You're
week,
welcome.
we are talking about safety and clinical evaluation reporting with Ross Meisner at Basel Systems. And I think there'll be an opportunity for folks to run a query live and get answers right out of FDA databases in an easy way. So I hope you can join me for that when I broadcast from a new location. This is a long weekend for folks in the United States of America. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. And thank you.
Thanks,
Jeff.
everybody.
I know.